Howdy, y'all. Today we'll be discussing biodiversity loss. First, we must understand what is biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of species and life in the world or in a particular ecosystem. It is important today as there is a large increase in biodiversity loss across the world. And first, we understand what are the causes of biodiversity.
So, firstly, some causes of biodiversity loss include habitat loss and deforestation, which are driven by economic demand. And then also pollution, which again is caused by deforestation techniques such as illegal logging and agricultural practices. They release fossil fuels and pollutants, thereby accelerating climate change. And then also tourism contributes to biodiversity loss because tourists tend to be more destructive on the land because they're not attached to the land. So they cause pollution and environmental degradation. And then also invasive species, disease, and poaching contribute to biodiversity loss. And then in terms of agriculture, monoculture also contributes because they are basically farming one crop, which means that the resilience is limited and thereby pests cause biodiversity loss in monocultures.
And then we have environmental, social, and economic impacts associated with biodiversity loss. Environmentally, biodiversity plays a big role in maintaining ecosystem health. So with less in biodiversity, we have less in maintenance of ecosystem health. An acceleration of climate change is also an issue with biodiversity loss because logging and agricultural practices that are used on forests release fossil fuels, specifically carbon dioxide, into our atmosphere and accelerate climate change. This also causes weakened ecosystem resilience and loss of natural balance. Socially, biodiversity loss plays a huge role with wildlife-human conflict. When food sources and resources that wildlife relies on is destroyed with their habitat, they're forced to search elsewhere, often in human-made agricultural areas. This ends up increasing wildlife-human conflict because it's results in crop damage and even retaliatory killings. There's also an increased risk of zoonotic diseases because research shows that specific animals are more likely to contain diseases that spread easily towards humans, and these animals tend to thrive in areas that are affected by human activity. But there is less dominated or in less human-dominated environments, the species carrying the diseases are less common and other species dominate. So losing biodiversity in these areas would increase the risk of humans being exposed to these diseases. Supportive violent practices is also a big issue associated with social impacts. Poaching and killing of wildlife and endemic species ends up being, supporting violent practices. And then cultural loss is a big issue. Species that indigenous and native tribes rely on being killed or being deforested ends up being a big impact of social biodiversity loss.
The final impact is economic. For example, declining ecotourism revenue, loss of biodiversity loss usually affects state national parks from many countries. Loss of government revenue, the loss of land is a loss of tax dollars that would fuel government initiatives to protect the environment. Increased loss from land degradation. With the loss of biodiversity is also caused by land degradation, which will cause an increased loss of more land. Finally, short-term gains versus long-term decline. One of the impacts of biodiversity loss is we'll get short-term gains from it, but it will create a long-term decline of both the environment and the economy in terms of profit in a long period of time.
So to all of these, or biodiversity loss is expanding protected areas. So parks and wildlife refuges, stronger environmental and economic policies like increased punishment for illegal logging and encouraging sustainable business practices. Removing invasive species like removing green crabs from the Puget Sound and composting and organic farming practices to avoid eutrophication and soil degradation.
There's also the photo of the orangutans walking across dead tree branches, which shows the detrimental effects of deforestation on native species.
And in the top right, there's a photo of a Hawaiian monk seal with a deep sea fishing hook in its mouth.
In conclusion, with the increase of biodiversity, mass cause by different sources will have devastating impacts on both our society, our environment, and the economic output that we as people on Earth can present. In overall, it will cause even more damage to a lot more future generations that'll be affected by this. Thank you for going over our project with us.